Welcome back to the Environmental Health Podcast. In this deep dive, we're going to try to help you prep for that big presentation you've got coming up on climate change and human health.
Right.
You've probably got stacks of reports to get through, right?
Yeah.
IPCC, the U.S. Global Change Research Program,
That's right.
even stuff on those awful European floods from last year. So don't worry, we've sifted through it all so you don't have to.
Yeah, we're going to zero in on sort of the most important insights,
Okay.
especially those that are relevant to your work here in the UK.
Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty of health impacts, let's start with the basics. What's actually driving these changes in our climate?
Well, the evidence is pretty overwhelming at this point that human activities are the main culprit.
Right.
We're pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and that's causing the planet to warm up. The Brooklyn Earth study really brings this home with their global temperature map.
Right.
It's basically a grid showing how temperatures have been rising since the 19th century.
I'm looking at that map now.
Yeah.
And it's pretty alarming.
It is.
Is there anything in that data that's particularly relevant to the UK?
Absolutely. Based on this data, the Berkeley Earth folks project that the average temperature in London, for example, could increase by almost 3 degrees Celsius by 2050.
Wow.
That's a significant jump.
3 degrees. That's a lot hotter than a typical summer in London.
Yeah, and it'll have a cascade of effects on everything from weather patterns to public health.
But how do those rising temperatures actually translate into, tangible environmental changes?
Well, that's where the IPCC's latest report, AR6, comes in. It paints a pretty stark picture.
Yeah.
We're talking about shifts in where different species can live,
Oh, wow.
mass die-offs in ecosystems, and even things like glaciers melting and permafrost thawing. And some of these changes are happening much faster than scientists initially predicted.
It's scary to think that some of these changes might be irreversible. Are there any specific examples from the IPCC report that stand out to you?
There are quite a few, but one that caught my eye was the alarming rate of Arctic sea ice decline.
Right.
This has huge implications for global weather patterns and sea levels, which of course will impact the UK as an island nation.
That's a good point. What happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. Okay, so we've got rising temperatures and some pretty dramatic environmental changes. Let's bring it closer to home. How is all of this impacting human health here in the UK?
Well, last year's devastating floods across Europe are a prime example of how climate change is already affecting us. These extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and more intense, and they have direct consequences for human health.
Yeah, the images from those floods were just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
But it makes me wonder, could something like that happen here in the UK?
It's definitely a possibility. One of the things we need to consider is the potential impact on the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC.
AMOC, refresh my memory on that one.
So imagine a giant conveyor belt in the ocean that moves warm water from the tropics up towards Europe and then sends cold water back down south.
Okay.
That's essentially what the AMOC does. It plays a huge role in regulating the climate of Europe, including the UK.
Ah, okay. That makes sense. So what's happening to this conveyor belt?
Well, a recent climate services report focused on Ireland raised concerns about potential changes to the AMOC due to climate change.
Right.
Any shifts in this system could have major consequences for weather patterns in the UK, leading to more extreme events like floods, droughts, and heat waves.
So we need to keep a close eye on the AMOC.
Yes.
But let's get into the specifics of how all of this impacts human health. What are the key things environmental health officers and students need to be aware of?
Well, there are several key areas where climate change directly impacts human health. And it's important to remember it's not just about dramatic events like floods.
Right.
Even small shifts in temperature can have significant effects.
That's surprising. I always assumed it was the big dramatic events we needed to worry about most.
They're definitely a concern, but the U.S. Global Change Research Program published a report, The Impacts of Climate Change on Human Health.
Right.
And it highlights that even slight temperature deviations from the seasonal average can lead to increased illness and even death rates.
That's pretty unsettling.
Yeah.
So even small temperature shifts matter. What does this mean for us here in the UK?
Well, for one thing, we need to be prepared for more frequent heat waves.
Okay.
This is a serious public health threat, especially for vulnerable populations like the elderly. And as temperatures rise, we're also likely to see an increase in heat-related illnesses like heat stroke. And it's not just the heat itself. Rising temperatures also have a knock-on effect on air quality.
That's a good point. We often think of climate change and air quality as separate issues, but they're actually closely intertwined.
Exactly. That same U.S. report highlights how climate change is a driving force behind worsening air quality. It's a bit of a vicious cycle, really. Warmer temperatures lead to more ground-level ozone, which is a major respiratory irritant. And we're also seeing an increase in the frequency and severity of wildfires, which release massive amounts of harmful particulate matter into the air.
Wildfires. But those are mostly a problem in places like California and Australia,
Right.
like not so much in the UK.
Well, that's the thing about wildfire smoke. It can travel thousands of miles. So even if we don't have major wildfires here in the UK, we could still be impacted by smoke from fires in other parts of the world.
Right.
And let's not forget about the rising pollen counts we've been seeing here in the UK.
Yeah.
Climate change is a major contributor to that, which means more people are suffering from hay fever, asthma, and other respiratory problems.
Yeah, I actually have terrible hay fever.
Oh, really?
I never really made the connection to climate change before. It's amazing how these things are all linked.
It is, and the impacts go beyond respiratory problems. We also need to be aware of the growing threat of waterborne illnesses.
Oh, right, water. We've talked about air, now water. What's the connection there?
Well, the U.S. report explains how extreme weather events like heavy rainfall and flooding can contaminate water sources, increasing the risk of waterborne diseases.
Okay.
And warmer water temperatures also create ideal conditions for harmful bacteria and algae to thrive.
Can you give us some specific examples of the kinds of waterborne threats we need to be aware of?
Absolutely. One example is harmful algal blooms. These blooms can release toxins that contaminate drinking water and recreational waters, posing risks to both human and animal health. We're also seeing an increased risk of Vibrio bacteria contamination, which can cause a range of illnesses from gastroenteritis to more serious infections.
That's concerning, especially given that the UK has such an extensive coastline. We need to be extra vigilant about monitoring water quality in coastal areas.
I agree. And it's not just about coastal waters. Climate change can also impact the safety of drinking water sources inland. We need to be prepared for more frequent droughts and heavy rainfall events, both of which can compromise water quality.
Okay, so we've got rising temperatures, worsening air quality, and contaminated water. This is starting to paint a pretty bleak picture. Is there anything positive we can focus on?
Well, there is one area that I find particularly fascinating, and that's the impact of climate change on food security and nutrition.
Okay.
It's an area that's often overlooked, but it has huge implications for public health.
Really? I never thought about climate change affecting the food we eat. How so?
Well, for one thing, research highlighted in the U.S. report indicates that climate change is actually affecting the nutritional content of our food. Certain crops, like wheat and potatoes, are showing lower levels of protein and essential minerals when grown under conditions of elevated CO2 and higher temperatures.
Wait, so the food itself is becoming less nutritious? That's a bit scary.
It is a concern, and on top of that, extreme weather events can disrupt agricultural production and distribution, leading to food shortages and price spikes. This can disproportionately impact low-income communities who already face barriers to accessing healthy food.
So climate change is making it harder to produce enough food, and the food that is produced might be less nutritious. It's a double whammy.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of food safety. Extreme weather events can increase the risk of food contamination, leading to outbreaks of foodborne illnesses. This is particularly concerning in the UK, where we rely heavily on imports for a significant portion of our food supply.
Okay, so we need to think about how to adapt our food systems to make them more resilient to climate change. But what about the psychological impacts? We've touched on physical health, but what about the effect on our mental well-being?
That's a crucial aspect that often gets overlooked. The mental health impacts of climate change are real and they're growing. The trauma of experiencing extreme weather events like floods and wildfires can have long-lasting psychological effects. And then there's the chronic stress and anxiety that many people are feeling in the face of the climate crisis.
It's like this constant feeling of dread and uncertainty about the future.
Yeah.
I've definitely felt that myself at times.
It's completely understandable. And this anxiety, often referred to as eco-anxiety, is becoming increasingly prevalent, especially among young people. They're growing up with the knowledge that the planet is in peril and it's taking a toll on their mental health.
So how can environmental health professionals help address this growing mental health crisis?
There are several things they can do. First and foremost, it's about raising awareness and acknowledging the mental health impacts of climate change. We need to create spaces for people to talk about their anxieties and fears and provide access to mental health support services.
That's a great point. It's about normalizing these feelings and making sure people don't suffer in silence.
Exactly. And beyond that, environmental health professionals can play a key role in advocating for policies and programs that promote both environmental and mental well-being.
Right.
For example, creating more green spaces in urban areas has been shown to have positive impacts on mental health while also helping to mitigate climate change.
So it's about recognizing the interconnectedness of these issues. It's not just about protecting the environment. It's about protecting people's health and well-being in a holistic way.
Precisely. And that brings us to a crucial question. What can we do to mitigate the health impacts of climate change and build a more resilient future?
Okay, so we've covered the doom and gloom. Now let's talk solutions. What are some of the key strategies that environmental health professionals can focus on?
Well, the good news is we're not starting from scratch.
Right.
There are already a lot of great initiatives and strategies out there, and a big part of it comes down to applying what we already know about public health to this new challenge.
I completely agree. And it starts with taking a proactive, preventative approach.
Yeah.
We need to shift our focus from reacting to crises to anticipating and minimizing risks before they escalate.
So it's about moving beyond the traditional ambulance at the bottom of the cliff model of public health. Exactly. Early warning systems are a prime example of this preventative approach. We've seen how effective they can be in providing timely alerts for extreme weather events, giving people time to prepare, and potentially saving lives.
I remember reading about the World Meteorological Organization's Early Warnings for All initiative.
Yeah.
Are there any specific examples of how this is being put into practice?
Absolutely. Mauritius and the Southwest Indian Ocean region have implemented some really successful early warning systems for cyclones and other extreme weather events. These systems have been instrumental in reducing the impact of these disasters on communities.
That's encouraging to hear. It sounds like we need to invest more in these kinds of early warning systems, especially as climate change makes extreme weather events more frequent and intense.
I couldn't agree more. And beyond early warning systems, we need to think about how to improve climate services more broadly. This means providing accessible and user-friendly information about climate risks and adaptation strategies to policymakers, businesses, and communities.
Can you give us an example of what a good climate service might look like?
Sure. Belgium and Ireland have both developed centralized climate service models that are considered best practices.
Okay.
They provide tailored climate information and support to a wide range of users, helping them make informed decisions about everything from urban planning to agriculture.
So it's about connecting the science to the practical needs of people on the ground.
Yes.
That makes a lot of sense. But what about those tangible on-the-ground solutions?
Yeah.
The things we can do to adapt to the changes that are already happening. What are some of the key adaptation strategies that are being implemented in the UK?
Well, we're seeing a lot of innovation in this area.
Yeah.
For example, coastal communities are investing in flood defenses and early warning systems to protect against rising sea levels. Urban areas are implementing heat health action plans, which include things like opening cooling centers during heat waves and planting more trees to reduce the urban heat island effect.
I love the idea of planting more trees. It's such a simple yet effective way to cool down cities and make them more resilient to climate change. It's a win-win for the environment and for public health.
Absolutely. And in the realm of food security, we're seeing farmers experimenting with drought-resistant crops and innovative irrigation techniques to adapt to changing precipitation patterns. There's also a growing movement toward local and sustainable food systems, which can enhance resilience and reduce our reliance on long, vulnerable supply chains.
So it's about supporting local farmers, eating seasonally, and being mindful of where our food comes from. It's great to see these kinds of positive changes happening. But adaptation is only one part of the equation, right? We also need to talk about mitigation, about actually reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that are causing climate change in the first place.
You're absolutely right. Mitigation is essential if we want to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And the good news is that there's a lot happening on that front, both globally and here in the UK.
So what are some of the key mitigation strategies that are being implemented?
The transition to renewable energy sources is a major focus. The UK has made significant progress in expanding solar and wind power, and there's a growing push for offshore wind farms, which have huge potential.
Offshore wind seems to be a big area of investment.
Yeah.
What else is being done?
We're also seeing a big push for energy efficiency. This includes things like upgrading building insulation, promoting energy-efficient appliances, and encouraging behavioral changes, like reducing energy consumption at home.
It's about making our homes and businesses more energy efficient, using less energy overall, and switching to cleaner sources of energy. That makes sense. But what about transportation? That's a huge source of emissions.
Transportation is definitely a key area for emission reductions. We're seeing a shift towards electric vehicles, improvements in public transportation, and even a resurgence in cycling and walking. It's about rethinking how we move around, not just relying on cars for every trip.
Right, we need to make it easier and more appealing for people to choose sustainable transportation options. But all of these changes require systemic shifts, right? We need policies and regulations to drive this transition to a low-carbon future.
Absolutely. Effective policies are essential for incentivizing emission reductions, promoting renewable energy, and supporting sustainable practices across all sectors of the economy.
So what are some examples of the kinds of policies that are needed?
Carbon pricing mechanisms like carbon taxes or cap-and-trade systems are gaining traction as a way to put a price on pollution and encourage businesses to reduce their emissions. We're also seeing regulations aimed at phasing out fossil fuels, promoting renewable energy, and improving energy efficiency standards.
It sounds like we need a combination of carrots and sticks to make real progress.
Yeah.
But policies don't exist in a vacuum, right? There's also the issue of governance, of how these policies are implemented and enforced.
That's a crucial point. Effective governance requires collaboration across different levels of government engagement with stakeholders and a commitment to transparency and accountability.
So it's not just about having the right policies on paper. It's about making sure they're actually put into practice in a fair and equitable way.
Exactly. And that requires strong institutions, effective regulatory frameworks, and public participation in decision-making processes.
This brings us back to that idea of collective action.
Right.
We need individuals, communities, businesses, and governments all working together to address this challenge. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together and that each of us has a role to play.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And ultimately, that's what I hope listeners take away from this deep dive. It's a daunting challenge, but it's also an opportunity to create a healthier, more sustainable, and more just future for all.
I love that. So to our listeners, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for that better future.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a pleasure.